part of this session if you would be able, as registrants, to go away and be able to reflect on your capacity to meet the HCPC standards about safeguarding and really plan any further CPD activity related to safeguarding that that is out there for you. And I'll also spend a little bit of time at the end of the session highlighting sort of HCPC support that is available for you. So as we start, really, it would be so helpful for me to get an idea about who has joined us today. So if it's okay with you, if you've got phones available, or in fact, if you can open an internet browser and go to Slido, which is our online polling software, you can access that by going to www.slido.com. One of my colleagues will pop that into chat and you can enter the event code for that, which is HCPC. And it would be super helpful for me to hear which profession you belong to. Which profession do you belong to here at the HCPC? It would be super to hear from you. So if you see me looking over to another screen, I should have said that in housekeeping. Please don't think I'm starting to ignore you. I'm just having a look at some of the results coming in. So this is super. We've got a really, really varied mix. Let me just scroll down a little here. Goodness, so it looks like we've got nearly all of our registrant groups are in attendance today. Oh, we've got 3 missing. Maybe we'll catch them for the next one. So we've got a large number of you here today. So we've got occupational therapists are leading the way. So we've got more of them today, followed by diet. Oh, so it's changing all of the time. Thank you so much. I'll give you a couple more moments. Really helpful to see the mixture of people that are around today. Thank you so much. I'm always fascinated by who comes to events, which professions maybe don't come to events as much, and it's really helpful for us to get this information. I'll stop this slide at this particular moment. Thank you so much, everybody. I think it really goes to show, doesn't it, about the multi-professional nature of HCPC and the number of different professions that we regulate can be really, really interesting. I'd quite like you to go to Slido again. I'm going to open a new poll and ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your knowledge and understanding of what HCPC standards say about safeguarding? Let me start that for you. So I'll just give you a moment to, okay. Okay. Thank you so much to everyone for taking part in this. This is really, really helpful. So this is interesting. So we've got we've got all of the, we've got different levels today, which is absolutely fantastic. Exactly what we need to be achieving in this session. We've got lots of different levels of knowledge about what HCPC say about safeguarding. So thank you so much. I'll just close this polling down shortly. Thank you so much. An average score of 5.9. We can work with that. Let's recap a little bit about the HCPC role. Okay, so just to really get started. So we are a statutory regulator, so regulating 15 different professional groups, and we've got so many of these professional groups attending today, which is super. Our role ultimately is about public protection. So ultimately what we need to do is maintain confidence in the professions and the public confidence in the professions that we regulate. So at the heart of this whole mission of ours at the HCPC is to uphold high standards in the professions that we're regulating. So regulation is a core function of what we do here at HCPC, and we achieve this in those 4 ways: by quality assuring education programmes and all training programmes that confer automatic right to be HCPC registered at the end of completion of the programme. We also maintain and publish accurate records and up-to-date records of professionals who can use our protected titles. And a hugely important part of what we do is setting appropriate standards. And as part of that regulation function, probably the last thing that we do, but probably the one that we're most known for, and we'd like to change that, is responding to fitness to practice concerns. So that's one of our statutory functions, taking action really to protect the public when necessary. But as part of our learning and preventative action programmes, what we're keen to do really is to be doing more of this and harnessing our data to make sure that we're taking much more in the way of an informed overview about the impact of our processes here at the HCPC, and really an attempt to improve our regulatory activity. So we really want to be making decisions and basing our future approaches on what we're learning from the information that we've got. And part of where I work really is in this, along with colleagues, is in our role in preventative action. So what we really want to do is develop an approach based on preventative action so that we can use our learning to address where the problems are and ultimately, hopefully, reduce the conditions that might contribute to instances of service user harm. So really what we want to do is be supporting people to understand our standards and helping registrants, really importantly, overcome any barriers that they face in meeting those standards in everyday professional practice. And ultimately from that, what we would like to see is a reduction in unnecessary fitness to practice actions, some of which could be so easily prevented. So as part of what we're doing today is in these My Standards events is trying to get out there just that little bit more and to raise some awareness of what the standards are saying, how the standards are changing and how you can engage with us here at the HCPC. So whilst we talk about standards, let's quickly recap what those standards are as they relate to practice. So we have standards of conduct, performance and ethics. So these are ultimately the standards, the 10 standards within these, and these ultimately outline what service users expect from you as a registrant. Standards of proficiency. So I've picked the option here of the clinical scientists. I don't think, I'm not sure if we've got any attending today, I can't remember, but we have standards of proficiency for all of our 15 professions. And these set the threshold standards, so entry-level standards that are necessary to protect the public. So each professional group has its own standards of proficiency, and these set out these really clear knowledge and abilities that you should have when you start to practice your profession. And importantly, standards for continuing professional development in your registration. So that's about you keeping up your skills and knowledge up to date throughout your career and setting out kind of our expectations for ongoing learning and development for you and supporting you to meet your CPD requirements. Let's focus on a little bit on the standards of conduct, performance and ethics as we begin to bring our webinar today around to safeguarding. The role of the standards of conduct, performance and ethics really is about setting out in general terms how we would expect our registrants to behave and outline what the public should be expecting from a health and care professional. And we use these standards quite a lot if someone wants to raise a concern about a registrant's practice. So if you're registered with us, it's really important, and you'll know this as registrants, that you must be making sure that you're familiar with the standards and that you continue to meet these standards in your practice. And ultimately, the HCPC position would be that all registrants are personally responsible for the way that they behave and will need to use judgment so that you can make informed and reasonable decisions and continue to meet the standards throughout your career. Making informed and reasonable decisions can also include getting advice and support from colleagues, education providers, employers, professional bodies, trade unions, other people, so many different people that we can use to really support us in this journey. I want to draw attention here to Standard 7 that's listed here about reporting concerns about safety and drill into that just in a little bit more detail today, because this is a standard of conduct, performance and ethics that really relates carefully to safeguarding. So if we look at that in just that little bit more detail, we can see that Standard 7 is split into two main areas about reporting of concerns and importantly about following up of concerns as well. So 7.1 through to 7.4 are about you reporting concerns, encouraging others to report concerns, taking appropriate action about any safety or wellbeing concerns of children or vulnerable adults, and making sure that the safety and wellbeing of service users always comes first before any professional duties or loyalties that you have to other people. And importantly, that second part, 7.5 through to 7.6, is about your requirement to be able to follow up. So concerns that you've reported, you have to, or concerns that are reported or that you become aware of, are followed up and if necessary escalated, and acknowledging and acting on any concerns raised to you, including those that you have noticed yourself. So our standards of conduct, performance and ethics really provide an important framework for safeguarding. What's interesting about safeguarding as a topic is it also features in our standards of proficiency, and our standards of proficiency have undergone quite significant change recently, and new standards of proficiency are now available. So the standards of proficiency are really about describing what professionals must know, understand and be able to do. So these are our professional standards that we consider are necessary for all registrants for safe and effective practice. And whilst they're based around a common set, Each set of standards is absolutely unique to each of our 15 registered professions. So there are 15 overarching standards, which are broken up into generic standards, which apply to everyone, and then standards that are specific to each profession. And the purpose, if you like, of the generic standard is to recognise that there's a significant amount of commonality across all of these professions that we regulate, and they're not hierarchical in order in any way. They're entirely, equally appropriate. And we really, oh, my apologies, something fell down in my home here. Everything is fine, but we write these standards. I can just tell my colleagues are going to be laughing in the background because these types of things always happen to me. We write these standards so much so that they're relevant to all registrants in the profession, regardless of their area of practice. And that feels really important to say, that the standards of proficiency are entry-level requirements. The language is about what, we're not aiming to achieve them, we all achieve them. And then according to how our roles develop and change over the course of our careers, then in fact, we can achieve in different ways according to the standards of proficiency, according to the work that we're in and the types of roles that we're taking on. The language in standards of proficiency is important because we want them to stay relevant. So we avoid very deliberately referring to law, specific technologies or specific working practices. So we really try to avoid that, to try and ensure that they remain really relevant over time. And this becomes really important to us as we begin to study issues around safeguarding, as the legislative landscape across the UK for safeguarding, and indeed even some of the basic terminology about safeguarding, is very, very different as we go across the United Kingdom and indeed internationally. What's very important to note is that the standards of proficiency have changed recently. So our new standards of proficiency are now launched, and they will come into effect from September of next year. So it's our job really in this webinar today to begin to look at some of these new standards of proficiency, and then particularly drill into how that might relate to safeguarding and some of the very subtle but important changes that are out there in terms of safeguarding and other areas as well. What's really important is that so much hasn't changed. There's still professional standards that we deem are safe and effective. They still set out expectations and they still hold applicants at the standards at the point of registration, at the point of renewal, or whether there's any concerns raised. The question has to be then, what has actually changed in these standards of proficiency? Well, what's quite important to note is that the wording of the standards has changed to move registrants away from what might be deemed in the old standards of proficiency to be having, quite a passive understanding of a particular standard. And the language of the whole standard of proficiency has moved towards much more active implementation and action towards achieving these standards. What's really important to note is that we've significantly expanded the role of equality, diversity and inclusion in the standard. So we've placed much more focus on including service users and involving them in decisions about their care and evaluating services. And importantly, we're also placing quite a lot of focus on fitness to practice and mental health. So looking very much at technology and digital skills, they're definitely strengthened within the new standards of proficiency for all registrant groups, and an increased focus on leadership as well. That need to understand how leadership applies to all levels of practice. So let's specifically now drill into how safeguarding looks in the new standards of proficiency. So our previous standards of proficiency would indicate that a registrant should really understand, if you like, the need to act in the best interest of service users at all times, and the specific piece of information in the standards of proficiency as they previously existed would be that registrants would understand the importance of safeguarding and the need to engage in appropriate safeguarding processes where necessary. And that statement has been tightened up quite significantly based on extensive consultation. So the new standard of proficiency that applies to all registrants is that we will understand the importance of safeguarding by actively looking for signs of abuse, demonstrating understanding of relevant safeguarding processes, and importantly engaging in those processes where necessary. So we've moved it away from a sort of passive, yes, I understand what safeguarding is and I understand what I might need to do, to placing more emphasis on registrants really having to look out for signs of safeguarding concerns for people that we are dealing with, and engaging very actively in processes to seek to eliminate and address those concerns. Previously, also, we had a standard at 6.3 that said registrants would be able to recognise and respond appropriately to situations where it's necessary to share information to safeguard service users or the wider public. And really importantly, that has been tightened up a bit. So what we're saying is we'd like registrants, or we need registrants, to be able to recognise and respond in a timely manner to situations where it is necessary to share information to safeguard service users, carers, and or the wider public. So what I'm hoping that you're seeing here is that the standards that are written specifically around safeguarding are a bit tighter, for want of a better word, and they're focused not only on understanding safeguarding from a theoretical perspective, but but really expressing that registrants have a very active role in safeguarding rather than a sort of passive bearer of knowledge about safeguarding. At this point, I'd quite like to stop and reflect, if that's okay with you, and think about any questions that you might have. My colleagues will be looking in chat to see if there's any questions. They can let me know if there's any questions at this point, and I'll give you a moment to type in if there's any questions at this point. But what I wanted to also do was to stop and have a bit of reflection, because as a registrant myself, I often stop to think, when I think about safeguarding, these are the kind of questions that came to mind for me. So how current is my knowledge of safeguarding in my local area? How would I go about raising a safeguarding concern in my line of work? And how confident would I feel doing this? And what are my particular barriers, or are there any barriers within my service as to safeguarding and how to go about raising safeguarding concerns? I'd also encourage a little bit of reflection around what experiences that you maybe have had yourself, or any colleagues I've had in raising safeguarding concerns, and thinking specifically about, is safeguarding spoken about enough in my service? Is it something that we do talk about, or is it something that we don't talk about? And are there opportunities there to improve that? And maybe what questions do I have about safeguarding now that I've seen the new standards of proficiency and see what safeguarding looks like and how it's been strengthened in the standard of proficiency? What might I have and what might I need to follow up on? I'll come over to my colleagues at this point to see if there's anything from chat that we could address at this particular point in time. This will also give me a moment to stop for a drink.
Yeah. Hi, Fiona. Yeah, we've got quite a lot of questions actually. So thank you, everyone. So the first one's from Samira. Is safeguarding the same for all professionals?
So my answer to that is yes. The safeguarding standards of proficiency are expected, if you like, are entry level. So all registrants need to have the awareness of safeguarding and the understanding of what they would do, and those that are working with service users will be actively identifying any signs of safeguarding issues. What we do recognise at the HCPC is that not everybody will be working in the same types of roles, or that not everybody will be as patient-facing perhaps as others, but that we all need to have that basic level of understanding and knowledge, and that when we do I'm trying to think of the word here, that when we do have concerns about safeguarding, or when we do work with people, that we know exactly what we would do about that, if that makes sense.
Excellent, thank you. We've got another one from Charmaine here. Is there a particular training or level of safeguarding course that should be completed?
Thank you very much, Charmaine. I think that's a really important question. At the HCPC, we have a quite a clear position that we very much stay away from telling people how to meet the safeguarding standards. And the reason for that isn't because we're shying away from it, but that what we notice is that professional bodies and employers all have very, very different recommendations about how to complete safeguarding training, and importantly they'll have different policies and processes in place. So whilst there's standard kind of acts of legislation that are in place across the UK, your employer will have its own specific safeguarding policy, and it would be a job of a registrant to seek advice from an employer or from a professional body and speak within colleagues about, okay, here are the standards of proficiency for safeguarding. What can I do? What does my employer require me to do? And I think what's really important as a follow-up to that question is that the HCPC position on safeguarding is that there's nothing in our legislation that would ever override what you're told to do locally. So when it comes to safeguarding, we have the kind of standard kind of position on it, and that you should follow local policy and local procedure to kind of meet your safeguarding requirements. The job really today is to look at actually what might your safeguarding kind of knowledge and skills gap be in relation to the standard of proficiency, and what support can you go on to seek from other people and from, you know, your employer, your professional body, to really progress in your safeguarding knowledge to apply it locally. That was a very long answer, sorry.
Thanks, Fiona. We do have quite a few questions, just as a heads up. But here's one from Jacqueline as well. How would we demonstrate that we actively seek safeguarding concerns?
So I think there's something, isn't there, about, I'm going to ask my colleague Kim to come in this actually, because I think Kim might be quite good for this particular question. The whole point, I think, is there's having knowledge, isn't there, and there's being actively sort of there's the base level of, you know, I know how to do this and I know what to look for and I know theoretically what signs per, you know, might be, but actually what I'm doing in my daily practice is I'm recording information about whether there are any safeguarding concerns, you know, whether I'm asking questions about safeguarding, whether I'm following up kind of actively on that. Kim, would you have anything to add to that? It's a great question.
I think it's a really good question. I think it's about having safeguarding in the forefront of our minds.
Yeah.
So if you, as a healthcare professional, if you get a feeling that something's not right, you follow your feeling and you follow your intuitive feeling, but you can't ignore something.
Yeah.
So it's about having, and that your trait, I think Fiona talked about how doing a gap analysis. So if you're feeling that you haven't got enough information or you don't know enough about safeguarding, as we're talking about it now, and particularly, Fiona, I love the question you said about how would I go about raising a safeguarding concern with my line manager, and also do I know who to raise a concern with? So if you're sitting here thinking, actually, the answer to those questions I'm not quite sure, and this is about identifying for you personally that you've got a safeguarding training need. And that you need to find some support, don't you, Fiona? And it's about us having safeguarding in our consciousness all the time and being aware of it as we're doing everything we do as healthcare practitioners. Yeah, and it's a great question.
It is a great question. Kim, what do you think about, I mean, sometimes I think that safeguarding becomes there's a potential that safeguarding becomes almost a word that we don't like to use. You know, would we record in notes, no safeguarding concerns, or would we check in with ourselves regularly about children and adults with whom we're working and, you know, note that actually there's no safeguarding concerns, or do we only write about it when there is a concern? We had this conversation in speech and language therapy in a service that I worked in my last employer. We used to sort of regularly reflect and think, well, actually, it's okay to talk about safeguarding when things are going well. We don't need to just talk about it when things are going badly, or Fiona, there's concerns.
I totally agree. And it's also about checking out with your colleagues. You mentioned as a team. So sometimes it's worth saying, did anybody else think that was concerning? Or did anybody else pick up some issues related to that home environment? Or did anybody else? It's checking it out with the colleague, isn't it, really, as well? It's really important. You mentioned that, working in a team. Yeah.
And I think this is the thing when we come in to drill into a little bit around safeguarding. You know, we'll talk a little bit more about safeguarding children and young people and adults today, just at a very basic level, to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the very basic training and actually ways in which you might go on to get more information about it. But I think this is it, that signs of harm and abuse are so often very subtle, very complex, and there are many of them sometimes. You know, that sometimes it can be challenging, and sometimes the opportunity to talk about it and understand when things are, you know, talk about when things are going well, talk about when things are not going well is missing sometimes, perhaps, in my view, in practice. Any other questions, Patrick? You said we had a few.
Yes. We've also got a couple of comments as well, which are really useful, I think, as well. So someone asked a question about what courses and training will be available. Rachel's come back and said, having worked in different areas of health and social care, safeguarding training has always been available, though different levels of how thorough it is, which is really helpful. Thank you for that, Rachel.
And that's interesting, isn't it, Rachel, just from the point of view of, you know, how you know, what you're, I know certainly my last NHS employer, they would have a recommendation that we as SLTs were trained up to this certain level in safeguarding, so that it went more than basic awareness, because we were dealing with quite, you know, vulnerable groups of people with communication support needs. So, and this is absolutely the point, that HCPC is never going to supersede what you're told to do locally. That's really, really important, to take local advice. We can't have, for good reason, a national sort of framework of everybody must do this, because you have to importantly comply with local legislation and local or national legislation in line with local policy. So yeah.
Thanks for that one, Fiona. There's another question here. If management is weak, how do we approach the safeguarding issues? And actually, I think Rachel's answered it in the chat as well, which is really helpful. And she said, we're all responsible for safeguarding, not just management. That's a very good answer, I thought, but do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and thank you very much, Rachel, for that reply, because I think it's really on point, isn't it? I think there are, if you think that your organisation, or that there are individuals within your organisation who you've maybe gone to speak to and maybe haven't followed up or followed through on their safeguarding requirements, then there are opportunities for you to raise that as a concern. You know, there's whistleblowing policies around that. If you think that something is not right within your organisation, that there are policies and processes, again, that you can consult locally that will allow you to identify that, because that's a very serious risk, of course. But I totally agree that, you know, it's everybody's responsibility. It won't become the manager's responsibility, but if you felt that there was a problem within your service and safeguarding concerns were not being heard, or the advice was not right to staff about how to deal with something, then, you know, we have to default to policies where we raise those concerns seriously and safely as registrants. So, and we don't deal with that as HCPC. We don't deal with services, we deal with individuals and how individuals work. So importantly, other organisations like the Care Quality Commission in England, that's correct, isn't it, Kim? Healthcare Improvement Scotland in Scotland. Apologies that I don't know our Northern Ireland equivalent. Do you, Kim?
Not offhand, Fiona, sorry.
I know, I wish I'd prepared
I'd have
that.
to look it up.
I was quite pleased with my answer there until that point where I thought I must go and look that up. But we'll follow that up when we send out links after this event, actually, about what would happen if if you felt that local policy wasn't good enough or wasn't being implemented well enough, because you as a registrant have a commitment, really, or have a requirement, sorry, to really raise that as a concern.
Thanks, Fiona and Kim. We've got another one from Lynn here. Does safeguarding cover professionals' workings out with scope of practice?
Does it cover professionals working outside scope of practice? Am I right in thinking that means outside? I'm wondering if Lynn means outside of kind of working environment.
I think so as a healthcare professional, I'm a healthcare professional when I'm off duty as well. So, you know, I'm safeguarding is everybody's business in every walk of life, and whatever we're doing. Do you know what I mean? Even if I'm out and about and I'm not working and practicing as a nurse, and I see something that's worrying, I could still raise that as a safeguarding concern, and raise my concerns. I think that's a difficult one if you're working outside your scope of practice. I think it basically does, Fiona, I'd say.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it will probably come down to there's potentially not a legal duty, but a moral and ethical duty. You know, I think, you know, I spoke to some colleagues in policy about this yesterday, that, you know, I don't know what our position necessarily would be if, you know, if you had a safeguarding concern outside of clinical life. So I had this very recently, actually. So I had to make a safeguarding kind of referral to the police about something that I'd witnessed happen to a young child. It's a very, very stressful process. So my legal requirement as an HCPC registrant, or my requirement as a registrant, you know, the standards don't necessarily cover that outside of clinical practice. You know, this child was not a service user or somebody who I was engaged with, but for me, ultimately, there's a moral and ethical kind of obligation. And I think as doctors are slightly different, you know, where they are, you know, obliged to offer care and support outside, you know, outside of their kind of working practice, for example. But as registrants, for us, perhaps not, but morally and ethically, I'd say there's a very strong requirement.
think it's a good point here. So thank you very much. People are great answering
Yeah.
questions in chat, aren't they, for themselves? But Veru has reminded us that we've all got safeguarding leads in our organisations.
We do.
And we have safeguarding champions, and they are people who've done, you know, extensive training in safeguarding, so they'll be an absolutely excellent source of advice. That's certainly who I would instantly turn to in those situations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if we don't know if you don't know who they are, it's a great outcome for today is to actually go away and make sure that we've got their names and we know who those people are. And actually, do we want to become one of these people ourselves? How could we do that? How could we bring our wealth of knowledge and skills as registrants, you know, as our experience develops, to be that person or to be one of a team of people that people can come to and speak to? Because I'm always up for that. And back to the earlier point, it doesn't need to be managers that do this so often. It can be, you know, you can be a contact person. Different services will run differently, of course, and have different requirements, but it's really important to know that you do have contacts, you do have safeguarding contacts locally. Are there any further questions at this point?
Yes, there's still a few here, Fiona.
We can have a second session at some point.
This is really good. I mean, I am conscious of time though, so we might have to move on shortly, and I'll make a note of the questions and we'll try to get an email out to the relevant people. I think that might be the best advice at this point. So
I'm happy with that.
Apologies everyone. We will make a note of the questions that you've asked and get back to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Patrick. As my colleague said, we've got quite a little bit to cover today. Really what I wanted to kind of do today was prop up these reflection questions to get you thinking about safeguarding and how you can meet these new standards and how you can go about changing your practice. We're pretty confident that many of our individuals, our registrants who have had safeguarding training will be meeting those standards and will have experience of those standards, but it's important to really think about, am I really, and how could I change? Am I up to date? Do I know what's happening? Do you know, and what questions that I have do I have that I might need to go off and follow up on? One thing I wanted to talk about a little bit today was about safeguarding children and young people versus some of the sort of terminology we use that is different when we come to safeguarding in adults. So safeguarding is not a term that's used traditionally in Scotland. We see that used in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We tend to talk about, in Scotland, we talk about child protection and adult support and protection. That's in line with the various laws and differences in laws in Scotland compared to our other UK nations. But ultimately, safeguarding is absolutely about protection of children from maltreatment, preventing impairment of their health and development, ensuring that they're growing up in circumstances that are consistent with safe and effective care, and taking action to enable all children to have the best outcomes. And there's a pretty damning report from NSPCC, which we'll link you to following today's session, just around some of the horrifying statistics really about 1 in 5 children experiencing, you know, severe maltreatment. Children, you know, who are being abused by parents or carers are almost 3 times more likely to witness family violence, and some really, really distressing kind of statistics around children who are experiencing sexual abuse, the poor outcomes that are associated for those children, and the strong associations with other problems that these children go on to develop. It is really important for us to think about the gradual emergence, if you like, of differing and almost new forms of abuse. So whilst that might seem like an odd thing to say, we know about abuse being, you know, mainly categorised into sort of physical abuse, neglect, emotional and sexual abuse and domestic abuse. We're beginning to sort of notice changes in types of abuse, you know, for example, modern slavery, human trafficking, and recognition, importantly, that young people are very vulnerable to abuse in a massive range of social contexts as well. And what can be really important as registrants to understand is that it can be a single very traumatic event, such as like a violent assault, for example, but it can so often be a very complex combination of events which ultimately interrupt or change a child's physical and psychological development. So it's a complex matter, and it's subject very much to professional judgment based on multi-agency assessment of the circumstances of the child or his family. So we have a professional duty to report concerns and to actively note concerns and take action on those. And ultimately the statutory and the legal duty will be with social services and with the police in the United Kingdom to be investigating that. But what is really important for us as registrants is where there are concerns about harm, abuse or neglect, or any form of abuse, that these must be shared with the relevant agencies following the appropriate protocols in place in your area, so that they can determine, if you like, and decide whether that harm is likely to be significant, that we don't get to decide ultimately as registrants what is serious and what's not. Our job really is to be reporting concerns. Some of the key messages that NHS Education for Scotland produced were quite helpful around this, about recording what was shared, for example, so that actually we need to make quite detailed records of things. And importantly, we have to consider the very important issue of consent. There is a very important distinction between making children aware that information about them will be shared and seeking their consent, but importantly, if a child is considered to be at risk of harm, relevant information must always be shared. Consent is not required from the child or from the primary caregivers, and we recognise the complexities and the vulnerabilities of registrants that they can feel and their need to seek support in-house from their employers in dealing with raising these concerns. Importantly as well, we have to think about relevant information. So we have to think about information that's shared as relevant, necessary and proportionate to the circumstances of that child. And what is very, very important is that point I'm coming back to around sharing information, that's an essential part of protecting children, that the balance of commitments really is about not us deciding whether something is important because a fairly minor concern that is raised by you might in fact create the jigsaw, complete a jigsaw puzzle of more serious concerns when that's combined with information from other agencies. Very quickly moving on to thinking about safeguarding of adults, we know that there are huge numbers of risk factors that increase vulnerability in adults. As a speech and language therapist myself, I understand these greatly, particularly around adults who are very frail or have additional communication support needs, so that there are a huge range of personal circumstances and environmental circumstances that really increase the likelihood of harm for adults. The safeguarding legislation, I'm just going to move on to that quickly, that's very different across the UK for safeguarding for children but also for adults. And these are the different acts that I've got linked here, which we will follow up if you in the information that we send you after the event today, just to show you that actually the legislative framework is quite different across Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. But ultimately what is primarily at the heart of all of this is doing the right thing, if you like, of identifying vulnerable adults and supporting people to have their needs met. I quite like the 3-point test that Scottish legislation uses at this point. So it determines that adults are at risk of harm if a 3-point test is met. So that's whether another person's conduct is causing, whether the adult is able to safeguard their own well-being, property rights, are at risk of harm, and because they're affected by disability, either mental disorder, illness, or physical or mental infirmity. These terms are quite old-fashioned, but they're coming from law, are more vulnerable to be harmed than other adults who are not so affected. And if we can meet that 3-point test, that also that we consider whether another person's conduct could be causing that harm, or whether the adult is engaging or likely to engage in conduct that would cause harm. But very similar to child protection or child safeguarding legislation, is under that Act, we're not the important ones in terms of determining whether somebody meets that 3-point test and whether someone is at risk of harm. We have to report what we see and what we are concerned about. And that's ultimately, I think, what underpins absolutely everything. Confidentiality and consent is key, of course. Adults have got the right to have their confidentiality respected and to give consent to information or to refuse consent to information about them being discussed or passed to other agencies. But you can speak to your own line managers about this, again following local policy, and your own line managers or safeguarding links within your own employers can decide whether further discussion has to take place. I think what's really important is that HCPC have some guidance on confidentiality for registrants. And what is really important about this is that nothing that we're saying or doing should limit your safeguarding capacity to act. So nothing that we state here in our guidance, whether it's our standard of conduct, performance and ethics, our standards of proficiency and our standards for confidentiality, nothing's going to limit you following local protocol. Local protocol is key. In terms of confidentiality, nothing limits your ability to act on safeguarding concerns, and our standards, importantly, are not determined by legislation. We draw back our standards somewhat so that employers, professional bodies, trade unions can have their own policies and protocols in order to meet their important safeguarding requirements. Let's come back briefly, as we're running a little bit short of time today, to understand the expectations of registrants. Our expectations of registrants on our new standard of proficiency would be that you understand safeguarding and can actively look for signs of abuse, demonstrating understanding of safeguarding processes and engaging in these processes where necessary, and that you will recognise and respond in a timely manner to situations where it is necessary to share information to safeguard service users. It's your local policy, your local employment policies and protocols that will allow you to understand what you should be doing in an individual situation and how you go about sharing information, seeking consent where that's appropriate, and dealing with that. Our standard of conduct, performance and ethics have not changed, particularly at this point in time, although our standards of conduct, performance and ethics are undergoing a review very imminently, and it will be interesting to see whether we strengthen any of the statements that we make here based on the feedback that you give us. So there will be opportunities to engage in our review of standards of conduct, performance and ethics forthcoming, and we'll send you some more information on how you can go about this. I found a really helpful resource actually on safeguarding, one of the NHS safeguarding apps that is available, which if you don't have, I would highly recommend that app to you, because I think it looked really, really solid in terms of its advice, support, challenging sort of what abuse, exploitation and neglect might look like. And again, I'd stop to come back to the questions that I gave you here about actually how could we leave today's seminar, you know, thinking about where our gaps are in our knowledge base or our ability to respond, to identify and respond to safeguarding concerns. And I urge you really from this today to stop and really think about what we could do to try to improve not only our knowledge of safeguarding, but to keep those conversations about safeguarding going locally, so that safeguarding is not a topic that we're afraid of, that we only talk about in negative circumstances. I think culturally, I think there's something very important that we can do about safeguarding to help registrants really meet standards and comply with local policies and protocols. If there's any further questions at this point, I'll take them in chat now, but we are running a little bit short of time, so we may have to address them after it. But what I would quite like you to do is to tell me a little bit about, at the end of this very short webinar today on a very complex topic, how would you now rate your understanding of what the HCPC standards say about safeguarding? So I'll start that there, and you can let me know kind of how you feel about that from today. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. So we can see a little bit of a shift, which is great, but I understand that you may have some outstanding questions or areas that you feel that we could address, so you can please do get in touch with us about this. I think one thing that I'd quite like to say about this is please do engage a little bit with us on our standards coming up. Our standards events coming up. We have a really exciting one coming up on technology and digital. We're doing some on leadership, service user engagement, duty of candour and supervision. And importantly to say today that we're going to follow up today. If there's any questions that remain unanswered in chat, I can certainly hang around here for another 10 minutes, but I realise that some of you may not have that time in your diary. We can look at some of these questions and follow up. Please do register for some further events. I would really, really, really appreciate if you could take some time today to tell me what you thought about today's session. Our job today was really to introduce you to what HCPC says about safeguarding and the standards, and how well you've understood those, and any changes that we can make to our learning events around safeguarding would be really, really helpful. So if you don't mind taking some time, my colleague could pop that link in chat as well for you. And just a reminder as well that if you don't mind, we would really love you to link in with us on our various social media channels, HCPC UK, Oh, sorry, I've just gone off that slide. Yes, I will. HCPC, the HCPC on Twitter, our YouTube channels, Facebook and LinkedIn. So please do get in touch with us. And you'll notice there the address for the professional liaison service. This is some of the work we're doing is in these standards. We would be delighted to hear from you if you think there's anything extra we can do to support you in your understanding of the standards, any questions that you may have from today that you've not managed to address. That would be really great to hear from you. Patrick and Kim, I'll go back to this. Are there any questions outstanding? I think you're going to say yes to that question.
No, Fiona, there are not actually.
Oh,
we've answered lots in chat, but do you know what's even lovelier is that other people in the session have answered to
wonderful.
people, which is always just so wonderful,
It's
isn't it?
so
People
good,
have recommended.
isn't it? It's
People
so
have
good.
recommended things that they thought were good, and they've lots of thank yous coming through to say thank you. And we've put all.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, though. Thank you. I love bringing people together and having these conversations, because I think, and certainly for safeguarding, I think you'll maybe hear my message today that I personally, and experience as a registrant, I think it's something we could be doing a lot more, is having the conversations and helping one another with actually what is a really complex topic area. So
Yeah, and I think, Fiona, lots of people have said thank you, but also there have been some really useful things about signposting people to CPD resources and other points of contact for safeguarding. So yeah, and we've put the evaluation link in chat, so people have already started doing that before
Thank you so much. Thank you. So it just leaves me today to say thank you so much. I realise not everyone here will necessarily work in the NHS, but we understand that many of our registrants do. So just a little rainbow slide. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us today, for giving us your time today. It's so valuable to have you here today. This is my first outing in a national webinar in this role, so my colleagues will tell you I've been just a little bit nervous about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Your time is very precious, and we're very grateful for your input today. Many thanks, everyone. I think we'll end recording now, shall we? And I think it just leaves us to say goodbye for today.